Nephilim and the gods of the old world, UFOs and alien abduction, transhumanism and artificial intelligence, wars and rumors of wars are all converging at the end of the age in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Join me and other engaging speakers in beautiful Bozeman, Montana, for an epic event like no other. NephCon 2025. What began on Hermon ends at Armageddon. Well, I am super excited today to be joined by a man that I have wanted to talk to for a very long time. I've been watching him on various podcasts and have been extremely impressed with the depth of his knowledge. And I've noticed that so many of Randall's ideas are correspond to the same kind of things that I've been thinking about. And so I can't wait to get into this conversation. Randall Carlson, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thanks for the invitation, Timothy.
Randall, can you start off for those in my audience who maybe don't know who you are? Can you talk a little bit about yourself, what your research interests are, and what you've been doing for the last few years?
Sure. Well, my background, my academic background is in geology and astronomy, but that's years ago. And I'd also say that areas like my interest in history, ancient history, the larger picture of things, how some of the great changes of climate and environment have affected the rise and fall of civilizations is of tremendous interest to me. It probably began growing up in rural Minnesota, just northwest of the Twin Cities, and where I lived was right on the margin of what was called the superior lobe of the Laurentide ice sheet. So over a period of many millennia, that margin fluctuated north, south, back and forth, and it sculpted a pretty unique landscape. And I grew up in that landscape with this sense that there was some kind of story there. And by the time I got to my young adulthood, I was convinced that I wanted to know more. I wanted to know about, I remember my father, I was probably 7 years old, my father telling me, well, there was once thousands of feet of glaciers here. And what? And he had a book. I don't remember what book it was, but he showed me a picture, and it showed this huge ice sheet, huge glacier. And I found that incredibly fascinating. And then, like a lot of boys back in that era, I was obsessed with dinosaurs. I just lived, everything was about dinosaurs for years, from probably the age of 6 or 7 up until I hit adolescence. And then at that point, my interest in life kind of shifted a bit to things a little more prosaic, which we won't necessarily get into, but it happens to a lot of adolescent boys about the time they go into middle school. Anyways, I eventually circled back at about 17 or 18. I had certain experiences and things that really stimulated my interest. And I've told this story before, but it's kind of an interesting story because there's a important, a valuable lesson in it. So it was summer of 1969. I'm 18 years old. And there is, every weekend in that summer, they had these free rock concerts up on a stage. It was local acts, but it was on bluffs overlooking the Minnesota River Valley. It was right next to an airport called Flying Cloud Airport. And it was real flat on top of the bluffs. The bluffs were 200 to 250 feet high. And I just remember distinctly this particular day, beautiful day, nice big armadas of cumulus clouds drifting through the sky. And I went over and I walked up on the bluff and stood up on this bluff and looked down into the modern Minnesota River Valley. And the valley there is just about 3 miles wide. And the river, the Minnesota River, at that point, it flows more to the north side of that valley. So it was almost just below me. I was standing on the north looking towards the south. And I'm just standing there taking in this breathtaking scene, and I'm looking at the Minnesota River, and it had entrenched its way into the alluvial floor of the modern valley. And I noticed that there was, these the landforms, and I could see the meander of the river. And as I'm standing there and I look out over this 3 miles, on the other side of the valley was a set of bluffs that pretty much matched the bluffs I was on. And apparently the this valley had been logged over. And so it made the geomorphology, the topography, much more discernible than it would have been, because I actually went back to this spot a few years ago. I wanted to find this spot where I had stood overlooking the valley, and what had happened is the forests had recaptured the floor of it, and so you couldn't see the topography as plain as I was seeing it, back decades ago. But in any case, to make a long story short, I was looking out over this valley, and I got this kind of weird impression. And the impression was that I was standing on the edge of a gigantic river valley. And it was sort of an expanded version of what I was seeing down here below in terms of the modern Minnesota River. In effect, I had no idea of this term. I didn't know this term then, but it was my first real impression of scale invariance, which, is the idea that things can be similar regardless of the scale. And I found that later to be the case in geometry, and discovered that the scale invariant phenomena was frequently utilized by ancient builders and designers and architects, but it's also very prevalent in geology. And if you open a standard geological textbook and they've got photographs in there, as often as not, more often than not, there will be something in that photograph that is there only to give you a sense of scale. Because in geology, you might be looking at an outcrop and you see a photograph of it and you go, is that 6 feet high or 600 feet high? But if there's a person standing there, and you can see that there's this massive cliff behind him, it gives you a sense of scale. Or typically, geologists, the traditional thing was to put their rock hammer in the picture, and then that gave you a sense of scale. But it could be anything. It could be a hat. It could be a cell phone. It could be anything that gives you that sense of scale. So going back to this experience, I guess I could have this sort of almost, it was kind of like an epiphany that took 10 years to play out. But it was just an impression I took away that I had been standing under the edge of this giant river. Now, fast forward about, fast forward about 15 years. It's the early 80s. And I had started now throughout the 70s, I've been doing research, very interested in geology. My profession, grew up third generation carpenter, builder. So I had gotten skills from my father and my grandfather about building, and so forth, and how to actually design a house. My father designed and built, 150 to 200 houses as my grandfather, his father, they were a father-son house building team, and they were master carpenters. And his dad was a Swedish immigrant, and they have very high levels of craftsmanship when it comes to, or at least did, when it comes to working with wood as a medium. Anyways, so fast forward about maybe 15 years, and I'm giving this lecture on ancient geometry, which had intrigued me from the early 70s. So at that point, I'm not, geometry, geology, very two things that are not generally conflated too much, other than the fact that the root of both words is geo, which means earth. But in any case, I'm giving this talk to this small group, and there was a fella in there that had a degree in geology. And I was talking about scale invariance in ancient art and architecture, that you can look and you can see if you understand the proportions of the whole composition, you find those proportions reflected in the parts. So I was explaining that, and then I kind of deviated off and I started explaining about scale invariant phenomena in geology. And I then told the story I just told you, that I was standing on this bluff and I had this epiphany. Now, 15 years later, I'm convinced that original impression was accurate, that I really had gotten this sense that had been a really big river valley. So, anyways, he challenges me. All right. He says, now that wasn't formed by a catastrophic flood. That was formed over millions of years. I remember very distinctly, millions of years, And I said, no, I think you're wrong, and I think I'm right. I can't prove it right now. And I hadn't ever read any studies on this particular feature, the Minnesota River Valley or any of that. I hadn't read a single study on it. Well, anyways, we argued in a friendly way. Him going away convinced he was right, me going away convinced I was right, even though what he was proposing was pretty much consistent with the mainstream view that prevailed at that time, and I was kind of the outlier. But it kind of really annoyed me, so I decided that I was really going to learn more about it. I said there's a lot of science here that I'm not familiar with. I had, and I'm going to backtrack just about 5 years. In the late 70s is, I guess, when I really started getting interested in the idea of catastrophism, because I had encountered the work of Jesus. He wrote a book called Path of the Pole.
I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, I mean, he's one of the most famous, and it'll come right back to me in a second.
What'd you say it was Path of the Pole?
Path of the Pole. And I'm kicking myself in the head.
Charles Hapgood?
Charles Hapgood. Thank you. Charles Hapgood. I encountered his work, Path of the Pole, and the essence of his work that came out initially in the 50s, and then he upgraded in the 70s, and I think came out with Path of the Pole around 76 or 77. So anyways, what he did in there was he looked at evidence for catastrophe in the natural order. Now, there were other names. You probably have heard of Manuel Velikovsky. He's probably the most famous one, but there was a half a dozen of them that were considered to be crackpots back then. And of course, they've ended up to be more accurate than the ones, their critics from the time. But anyway, so Hapgood had this book, Path of the Pole, and he documented pretty much all the evidence for a catastrophe that was available in the mid-70s. And that included the geological evidence. It included paleontological, because he was looking at mass extinction events. I think he was looking at, geomagnetic pole flips and excursions. He did get into some mythology, as did Velikovsky. Velikovsky kind of built his whole scenario on the interpretation that ancient mythology was actually recording historical events.
Right.
Catastrophic historical events. So anyways, I had really wanted to get that book. A fellow that I knew was writing a book at that time about catastrophism. He was he was one of the gentlemen actually that introduced me to Freemasonry. And he was writing a book, which he's since passed away. The book was pretty fringe, actually, as it turns out. But he introduced me to Hapgood. And I thought I really wanted to get a hold of Hapgood's book. At the time, I remember I couldn't find it, or I did find it. You couldn't go online and search for a book back in 1978. So one day I went to a library sale, one of these that's in a parking lot with the big tent and everything over that. And I went in, I was browsing the books, and sure enough, there was Hapgood's book, Path of the Pole, hardback, original edition. I think they wanted $1 or something for it. So I grabbed it, I read it, just consumed it. And then over the next year or two, he had a very extensive bibliography. And so I made it one of my goals to try to read every article that he referenced in his bibliography. And I came pretty close, actually, to doing that. But that had led me into the study of catastrophism, but not necessarily through that lens of, obviously very much geology, right? Yet there was still a lot of geology, hydrology, glaciology, oceanography, things like that I just was not familiar with, but I had touched upon them superficially. So I took this deep dive. So now come back. I've given this lecture the guy, actually, I remember his name was John. I won't mention his last name, just in case he's listening. If you are John, you do know by now that I was right and you were wrong. So that's just a personal message to John. Um, so, anyways, I, at that point, I decided I wanted to start getting out more into the field, and I took a series of geology courses. I needed more math, so I took a couple of years of mathematics to try to be able to handle some of the hydraulic equations, and because I got the two things that really fascinated me the most, I guess, was mega floods
Hmm.
and impacts. Because now, again, backtracking a few years as a kid, being very interested in dinosaurs, some of these cheesy dinosaur movies that they made back in the mid 20th century and stuff almost always ended with a cataclysm of some kind. You know, the island sinks or the volcano blows up or whatever, and the heroes get away just in the nick of time. And I had this Viewmaster set. If you remember, did you have a Viewmaster as a kid? You know, you have the round 3D.
Yeah,
You
and you
put it
click the
in the
thing.
slot. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, yeah, I did. Yep.
Okay, you did.
And it gives you it gives you like a series of slides on a like a
Yes,
circle thing. Yeah, like on a
yes.
disc. Yeah.
Well, what I for my fifth birthday, I remember my older brother got a new one, and so for my birthday present, I got his cast off Viewmaster. Included in there was the three card set about dinosaurs, and they had scenes that had been in a movie called Animal World, and it was a movie that came out in the 50s, and it was about about the evolution of animals. And so they had a sequence in there about dinosaurs, and they had the 3D animatronic dinosaurs. I don't know if you remember, that's how they did it back in
I
those
do.
days. You'd have a model, and they'd shoot 2 frames at a time, move the model a little bit. Anyways, what these were scenes from that movie, and I just got obsessed with like looking in there, like imagining it was a late Cretaceous world, and you know, learning about the dinosaurs. So I got very interested in that. And one of the things was at the end of this series, the dinosaurs are destroyed in a big catastrophe. And it shows, the ground fracturing and opening up and the dinosaurs falling in and the sky going red on fire. It planted that idea in my mind. And so now fast forward to 1980. And you know what? Remember what the significance to me of 1980 is this. Independently, three different teams came up with evidence and scenarios that the extinction of the dinosaurs wasn't some prolonged thing, but it was catastrophic and it was triggered by the impact of something from space.
Hmm.
And that was a major turning point within, I
Yeah.
think, the acceptance of catastrophism as a.
If we can just digress for a moment into for the audience, what you're referring to is something that a lot of people are unfamiliar with today, and it is this age-old battle between
Yeah.
what's called geologic catastrophism versus geologic uniformitarianism. And this really began back in the late 1700s with a guy named Charles Lyell, a geologist named Charles Lyell.
Yep.
And he wrote a very influential book called Principles of Geology. In fact, Darwin based much of his own theory on Lyell's Principles of Geology. And Lyell's book popularized the doctrine of what's known as geologic uniformitarianism, the premise of which propounds, and by the way, I'm reading from my book, Birthright here, the premise of which propounds that the geologic processes presently acting upon the Earth are sufficient to account for all geologic formations in all ages. The theory necessitates vast quantities of time for profound alterations to the Earth's crust rather, and repudiates the assumption that cataclysm rapidly reshaped the landscape in the distant past. And if you'll indulge me here for a moment, I'm going to read a couple more paragraphs for the audience to understand the implications of what you're talking about. The geologic doctrine set forth in Lyell's Principles was a radical departure from the scientific consensus of the time, and indeed
Yes.
of all times, and a blatant disregard for the testimony of antiquity. We'll talk about that in a minute. The uniformitarian model, the present is the key to the past, supplied by Lyell and his colleagues, provided a new lens with which to view the geological record and refute the evidence of the flood or the great cataclysm that the ancients talked about by presuming that the forces acting upon the surface of the earth had been uniform from the beginning. The sudden upheavals of cataclysm could be replaced with the slow grind of endless time, and the ancestral witness of humanity discarded like an old rag. Lyell's principles were enthusiastically embraced by atheist academics who were eager to undermine the veracity of the biblical narrative and the prevailing theory that supported it, catastrophism. Geologic catastrophism propounds that the surface of the earth has undergone extreme and rapid change due to cataclysm. Before Lyell, the doctrine of catastrophism was universally accepted as plain fact. Today, it is roundly rejected in the scientific community, not because it has been refuted. Indeed, evidence in support of the doctrine mounts by the day, but largely because it undermines the theory of evolution and is therefore regarded with contempt. I wrote that in my book, Birthright, and I just wanted to frame, give people context for what you're talking about, because today, almost exclusively, and I don't know if this was your experience, Randall, but today in university, if you're studying to be a geologist, I'm not a geologist. I never went to university. Famously, I dropped out of high school and moved to the Amazon jungle. But geologists today are exclusively taught uniformitarianism. And uniformitarianism, it completely belays the notion that the earth has been dramatically shaped, the surface of the earth has been dramatically shaped by cataclysm. And that's what you're talking about, what you witnessed out there with your own eyes. And it would seem that to a lot of casual observers, that seems preposterous. I think most people would assume, and indeed this was the assumption leading up to the advent of Charles Lyell, that catastrophism was the correct geological view. But that's been contested. So I just wanted to put all this in context for people who aren't familiar with this controversy, this ongoing controversy in geology. So that's a little insert there, hopefully I was able to put some of what you're saying into context. So continue, sir.
Well, that was an excellent summation. Excellent. I mean, I think you nailed it. And
thank you.
Yeah, there was definitely pretty much a consensus around that there had been a catastrophe in the foundling days of geology as a scientific inquiry. Although there was no academic institution of geology, that came later. And when that was established in the late 1800s, they pretty much went straight to Lyell for their dogma.
Yes.
And, it was also Hutton and Playfair. They were the big three of gradualism, but yes, Lyell had the most impact, I think, on the thinking. And this is why when J. Harlan Bretz came along in the 1920s and proposed these gigantic mega floods out in the Pacific Northwest, he was roundly dismissed.
That's right. Yep.
Because you're trying to bring back biblical catastrophism. Well, look, we got past that. Now, I think we should, for the sake of fairness, say that the basic principle that the present is the key to the past is a valid working principle.
Yes,
and it's very useful, extremely. My interpretation is that, when you look at it in the narrow lens and you say, okay, uniformitarianism, or maybe a simpler term might be gradualism, but within that framework, things have occurred incrementally. And on such a scale that typically it would take a lifetime or multiple lifetimes to really discern natural.
That's right.
However, the exception to that was what was allowed was local or regional catastrophes, because these are being witnessed and experienced by people, a local flood. And so then any evidence, like when Brett started coming out with evidence for mega floods up in Washington State, a lot of the critics were saying, well, this is really just a series of local floods over a period of time. It's probably associated with the glaciers in the Ice Age, but it was nothing that allowed for 300 or 400 million cubic feet per second peak discharges.
Hmm.
It was, that is still very much the interpretation today, is that a lot of these events were not catastrophic in the sense that they occurred over days, but only over millennia or longer. I'll
Right.
swing back to Minnesota River Valley because, to say, I was eventually vindicated when I was probably by the time the late 80s came around, I had actually come upon some geological studies, and it turned out that on the western border of Minnesota. Minnesota, by the way, is not on either of the oceans, in case people are. Anyways, on the western border, if you look at a map, you'll see that there's this bump on the western. And as a kid, I was always intrigued about why didn't they just have a straight line instead of that bump? Well, the bump actually turns out that it's a deep incision, and it was the southernmost outlet of what was called Glacial Lake Agassiz, which was this gigantic volume of glacial meltwater. And it turned out that this draining of Glacial Lake Agassiz through that outlet at a place called Big Stone Lake. And that's a hint right there. Big Stone Lake is because right at that outlet there are a collection of really large stones, undoubtedly dumped in the wake of the flood passing through there, the discharge outlet. Well, it was that flow that carved the valley of the Minnesota River. And so the modern Minnesota River simply flows in this oversized channel, and you can picture that if a modern river, and I'll mention this, so you're able to calculate peak discharge by a couple of things. You look at the channel geometry. That's one of the primary things you look at. And then you look at the gradient of the channel. If it takes 200 miles to get from, let's say 6,000 feet above sea level to sea level, because that's ultimately where all this water is going, it's going to be moving fast with a lot of energy. If it's a long, slow gradient, like let's say from where I was living down to the Gulf of Mexico, which is over 1,000 miles, it's going to be a much more sluggish flow. But in either case, you can picture that if you've got an oversized channel, the modern river, once it gets in there, it's trapped, right? It's not going to, there's been no flood like the Agassiz flood that cut that valley that has been able to overtop that valley. Remember, I just said there was about 250 foot bluffs?
Right.
So the water would have to be 3 miles wide and 250 feet deep to overtop. So once you get the modern flow regime in one of these oversized valleys, that's where it's stuck, unless there's some kind of unusual event that intervenes. Well, what I learned from the studies was that the flow that created this valley was 4,000 times greater than the modern discharge of the Minnesota River. And this has been well established now. And so I felt like at that point I was vindicated in my discussion with this gentleman had a geology degree who tried to humiliate me in front of the public. Not really. But it was an interesting discussion, and it stimulated me to really begin to start learning more about the scientific context and whether the science in my mind, it was this: if I immerse myself into science, I find out what the geologists are saying, and the paleohydrologists and the glaciologists and all of those different scientific disciplines. If I can find out what they're really look at what they've got, is it going to support or contradict the idea of catastrophism? Mm-hmm. Well, the more I learned, the more I realized, well, yeah, I mean, it actually completely supports the idea of short-lived catastrophic events.
Yep. And as I said before, and in the excerpt I read there from my book, one thing that catastrophism does conveniently, rather uniformitarianism, one thing that uniformitarianism does conveniently for geologists and then for historians and archaeologists is it absolutely, as I said before, belays this notion, this universal truth of the ancients, that earth-shattering cataclysms has not only shaped the surface of the earth, but civilization. And those two things go hand in hand. Uniformitarian, let me say that word again. Uniformitarianism and the conventional timeline of history go hand in hand. Just like, we can understand the unfolding of geology in the way that we observe things today, and it's very gradual, this gradualism. That's kind of the same way that conventional historians and archaeologists look at the past. That it's just a very gradual, linear progression from cavemen to modern man. Those two things, and I want the audience to understand, those two things are connected. They're intricately connected because if you come from an alternative historical perspective, then you subscribe to some kind of a catastrophism that the ancients were correct. The ancient Egyptians, the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, and so forth were correct when they talked about cataclysmic events that annihilated civilizations and that mankind had to restart again. And so those two things are associated. Catastrophism and the witness of the ancients are tied together, are associated. So you have these two very opposing worldviews. You have the ancient record, the ancient testimony that involves cataclysm, not just sudden transformations of the Earth's surface, but the sudden destruction of civilization and then the rebuilding in the aftermath of cataclysm. Those ideas are intricately connected, intrinsically connected. And over here on the other side, uniformitarianism and the conventional timeline of history and the gradual learning of mankind, of the arts of science, going from the apish caveman all the way to what we consider today to be the pinnacle, in this view, the pinnacle of mankind, modern man with all of his achievements. It's very interesting. So that's why both geologists and let's call them conventional historians and archaeologists get so irritated with people like you and people like me, catastrophists and alternative historians, because you're not just attacking one worldview, you're not just attacking one pillar of modern science, you're attacking two simultaneously. You're attacking both the geological doctrine of uniformitarianism and you're attacking the conventional timeline of history. So you're taking a shot at both modern geologists and modern historians simultaneously.
And throw in Darwinian evolution.
And bingo, and Darwinian evolutionists. And in fact, I'm trying to find the quote here, but Darwin said that, I'm trying to find the exact quote, but I'll just summarize it. That
I think I know which one you're coming. It's an excellent
he
quote.
actually acknowledged Lyell
he did.
in his book, The Origin of Species. And what was the exact quote? I've got it somewhere here in front of me, and I don't see it. But he said something to the effect that his theory would have never come about without Lyell first laying that foundation and giving him the advantage of millions of years of gradual, slow change. And so, though you're right, those three things are all intricately connected. Uniformitarianism, the conventional historical timeline, and Darwinian evolution. They're connected at the hip. And that's why they go berserk. Like when you go on Joe Rogan and you make these obvious observations as a geologist, they go berserk. They lose their minds because you are attacking the foundations of conventional science in the fields of geology, evolution, human origins, and history. If you enjoy my analysis on these topics and would like to hear more from me, I invite you to join the Alberino Analysis members community, where you will gain access to my weekly private briefings, live stream Q&A sessions, behind-the-scenes updates on my current projects and expeditions, community features that facilitate interaction with myself and other members, early access to tickets for events I happen to be conducting, and a convenient mobile app to keep you notified and up to date on everything I publish. In addition to all this, annual subscribers will be treated to an advanced screening of 3 episodes in a TV series I've been working on for several years. These films alone are worth the price of admission. The Alberino Analysis members community is the best way to connect with me and support my work. If you would like to become a member, you can find a link to the subscription page in the description of this video, or visit thealberinoanalysis.com. I hope to see you in our community.
Speaking of Charles Darwin, I have a pretty interesting, it's more reflective on the state of animal life after he came to North America, and he became familiar with some of the fossil evidence for the great Pleistocene megafauna, which I'm sure you're quite familiar with.
Yeah.
So in 1836, he wrote this, and it has, to me, certain sort of implications as far as catastrophism, that even in 1836, Charles Darwin still was cognizant of the fact that there may have been other forces at work on scales beyond. Of course, now this is pre-Charles Lyell, but anyways, this is what he said. It is impossible to reflect on the state of the American continent without astonishment. Formerly, it must have swarmed with great monsters. Now we find mere pygmies compared with the antecedent allied races. Now, we could bring that in too as well, that we're in catastrophism. Now, I know you have an interest in the Younger Dryas and those events.
Yes.
The termination of the glacial period, which seems to have been such a concentrated time of change and catastrophic change. It's almost like the perfect storm of catastrophism during that time that involved multiple things. We certainly see end of the great megafaunal era when, Charles Darwin's swarming of great monsters, which would include the woolly mammoths and the mastodons and the
giant sloths.
Giant sloths. What an incredible bestiary that most people are completely oblivious to the fact that this once existed. This was the Serengeti Plain.
That's right. Right here in America, right where your house is built.
Yes. Elephants would have been, mastodons would have been browsing in your backyard. A mere 12
Cave bears.
Cave bears, yeah. Ursus spalius, or spalius, cave bear. And he was a monster, but he wasn't quite the monster of the giant short-faced bear. That was probably one creature you wouldn't really want to encounter.
What was the size of the giant short-faced bears? Isn't it like 4 times or 3 times the size of a Kodiak bear?
Well, let's see here. I actually have a graphic right here that I had gotten together for.
It really blows my mind to think of those beasts roaming what is today modern America, where we have our not shopping malls anymore. That's old hat. But where we live, right here where we live, all over North America, these amazing animals existed, and they were all wiped out in a geologic instant.
Can Andre or Andre?
Andre,
can he give me screen share capabilities?
While you're getting that up, I found the excerpt that I wanted to of what Lyell said. So I wrote this in my book Birthright. Charles Darwin was an avid proponent of Lyell's principles, which had conveniently provided him with the missing ingredient for his own theory: unlimited time. And then this is what Charles Lyell wrote. He who can read Sir Charles Lyell's grand work on the principles of geology he wrote in The Origin of Species which the future historian will recognize as having produced a revolution in natural science, and yet does not admit how vast have been the past periods of time, may at once close this volume. And then I write this: the smugness with which this pronouncement is made would become a defining characteristic of Darwin's disciples in the 20th century.
Yeah, well put. Well, I guess I'm going to need to add your book to my reading list now, Timothy.
I'll send you a copy.
Oh, that'd be awesome, man. Would you be so kind as to sign it for me?
Of course I will.
Okay. Well, I have some, not to divert too much, but I have a couple of interesting graphics, and you asked specifically about.
Yes, the short-faced cave bear.
So I could describe it, or I could show you some of the reconstructions and so on, if Andre can give me screen sharing capability. Let's try it and see if I can do it. Okay, maybe so.
There we go.
Oh, good. Okay, you're just seeing okay, here we go. So first we've got the modern African elephant jaw next to a mastodon jaw. So you can look at the jaws on the jaw bones on the left, look at the jaw bones on the right. Now, so early explorers were finding these jaws of mastodons. They were quite prolific back in the 1700s and 1800s, particularly along river banks and back flood areas. So they're finding these and basically thinking they're finding the jaws of monsters. And at the time, it was not known that they're extinct. In fact, there's an interesting story, and I'm not going to try to tell it too much other than the fact that Thomas Jefferson, was very interested in the antediluvian fauna of North America. And when Lewis and Clark were preparing for departure for their famous journey across the continent, he sent in secret instructions. I believe it was George Rogers Clark sent secret instructions that while they were traversing the western wilderness, to keep their eyes open for the American incognitum, which was the name for the mastodon, because Jefferson didn't know that they were extinct. He thought they might still exist.
That's fascinating.
The secret instructions were that if at all possible, to capture one and return it to Washington. I think he maybe was anticipating he could have it as a pet in the White House. I mean, I don't know what.
I had never heard that. That is really, really fascinating.
It is, yes. Anyways, since I've got this open here, let me go to the next slide. Mastodon skeleton, the great American incognitum. Unearthed by Charles Wilson Peel in 1801 in the Hudson Valley. Then I got a human figure coming in, me in the earlier days, just to give you a sense of scale. So these guys were roaming all over unglaciated North America. A lot of them, herds of them. In fact, the mastodon is a browser. So he was typically in a forest environment, ate a lot of tree branches. The mammoths were grazers. So you found them more out on the plains and on the savannas. But let's see, I should have a cute little fella there. If they ever do succeed in cloning these and bringing them back, I'm still around. I think I really would like to have one as a pet. I'm thinking I could have used a beast like this back on some of my construction projects in the early days. One of my favorite artists, now I don't even remember his name.
Maybe they were used in some of the early construction projects.
Well, as a matter of fact, I've speculated along those lines, and I think it's entirely plausible. Just to give you people example of the bestiary, the giant Irish elk and dire wolves. Now,
the Irish elk, was that in North America too?
No, but there was a North American counterpart to the Irish elk.
But the dire wolves were here.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, they were here. Yes.
Wolves.
Yeah. The American Pleistocene lion, which was almost the size of a horse. Let's see here. Mammothus trogontheriae. This was the guy that was 16 feet tall at the shoulder. But let's see. Where is the cave bear? Okay, so this was on there we go.
There it is.
This is your grizzly bear skull compared to that of the giant cave bear.
Jeez.
So
It's it's amazing. I often wonder how in the world could humans have survived in the same environment as the short-faced cave bear.
well,
I mean,
I mean, how, you just don't really grasp how different your lifestyle would be if you woke up in the morning and one of your primary goals of the day was not to get eaten.
precisely. Yeah. By a bear that makes a grizzly bear look like a golden retriever.
Yeah, now this is actually the giant cave bear, which was a different species than the giant short-faced bear, but let's see. Well, there's the giant cave bear skeleton compared to a grizzly skeleton. I thought I had one in here. Let's see, giant cave
So
bear.
those must have weighed what, a few thousand pounds? Because
Oh yeah,
a
they
large
could.
grizzly bear can weigh up 1,500 pounds.
Oh yeah, they could be over a ton. So that's a pretty formidable bear. I got this photograph here. This is Graham Hancock. You know who he is?
Hmm.
Yeah. So we were traveling together when he was writing his book Magicians of the Gods. We stopped at a place just south of the Black Hills, South Dakota, called Hot Springs, and there's a series of sinkholes there that have trapped a bunch of extinct megafauna. So they had a museum set up there, and this was an interesting. I mean, this is just I don't know what it is. It's a reconstruction, obviously, of a mammoth, but it was life size. It was true to size. So again, you had these incredible beasts roaming North America. When you think elephants now, you think Africa first, then probably India. But North America was proliferating in elephants, proboscideans. But you're right. What you said is important. They disappeared in a geological eye blink. And to me, we have to look at causes. And I'm sure I'm going to ask you this because I'm sure you're going to know. What do you think has been the prevailing standard model cause for extinction?
What's it called? Basically, that humans killed them. What's that
Yeah,
called?
the overkill.
Overkill. The overkill theory, right? That
Yeah,
we wiped them out.
yeah, that's pretty much it. And
Yeah.
I was, that's what I encountered in the 70s and 80s over and over again when looking at these, with a few exceptions of people like Hapgood and Velikovsky and a small handful of others. But that just somehow, the more I learned, the more,
It's absurd.
the more absurd it became. Because okay, so I thought, okay, how many woolly mammoths? Or not woolly, because that was a species. How many mammoths were there in the world of all the species? There were 4 species of proboscidean in North America. Okay, if you look at the total number of species that existed, say during the late Pleistocene, which is pretty much the era of the ice ages.
The Ice Age. Yeah.
If you look at that and you go, okay, so they disappeared somewhere between, basically the dates are 11 to about 15,000 years ago, and those dates are constantly getting refined as we improve our dating methodologies, right? But you go, I'm going, okay, so how many mammoths were there in the world? So I dug around. I found a reference by he was an anthropologist who studied extinct megafauna, and he estimated that there were 10 to 12 million mammoths in the world. Okay, so then I later went, and I've kind of refined this, looked at, what are the estimates of the human population during the late Pleistocene? And it's varied, but it was minuscule compared to now. Basically, the standard belief is that there were between 5 and 10 million people in the world. Okay, let's think about that for a minute. It's very plausible that the proboscideans outnumbered the humans. Now, if humans are going to, exterminate the mammoths, right? And you look at let's take 10 million as the number of humans. That's the total number of humans now. So that includes children, women, elderly.
Yeah.
Well, how many does that leave of like hunting age males that would be out hunting? Let's say a quarter of that. So, 2 to 3 million. So how are you going to exterminate 10 to 12 million mammoths worldwide when there's for every hunter there's probably 4 mammoths? How do you, when you begin to think about that, it just doesn't make the slightest bit of sense.
Machine guns.
Well, well, yeah. Look at the near extermination of the American bison.
I was just about to say that. And this is why it's
Yeah.
absurd to me, because we know that the Native Americans out here in the West, I live in Montana, and like the Comanche, for example, these guys were smart enough
Yeah.
not to exterminate the buffalo. It was the
Right.
white man who did it, and in part, we did it to get rid of the Comanche.
Yes.
The Comanche were smart enough. This was their main resource of food, and this is what they built, their clothing and everything. And we just assume that these people living in the Ice Age were so stupid that they would just exterminate their food source and their source of clothing, and it's just absurd.
Yeah, even if it was physically possible to do it.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah. And so the extermination of the American bison was a deliberate government policy.
Yeah.
Well, you were implying that, I presume, there.
Right, to get part of the reason was to get to we couldn't beat the Comanche, and we realized that get rid of the buffalo, get rid of the Comanche.
And it actually was wider than that because, there was railroad interests
That's true.
influencing that. The problem with building the railroads was, and this is across the plains, growing up in Minnesota, I learned a little bit about this and investigated it further in adulthood. But yeah, getting rid of the Plains Indians as well. And
That's right.
it was some of the Civil War generals that after the conquest of the South by the North, Sheridan and Sherman were redeployed to the West to lead the war against the native tribes.
That's
and
right.
It was Philip Sheridan, that came up with the famous saying that the only good Indian is a dead Indian.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the one who came up with the brilliant idea of, hey, why don't we donate them blankets, but let's contaminate them with smallpox.
Smallpox, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, some pretty horrible episodes in American history that a lot of people should know but don't know. Anyways, yeah. But what we did see, to go back to the bison themselves, that around the turn of the 20th century, their numbers were just down to a few hundred. I mean, they came this close to becoming an extinct species. Interestingly, look how fast they've recovered. They've had help, obviously, but if we just stayed out of the way, they would have rapidly repopulated, within a century or two. So if you think about that, if you're a paleontologist and you're looking back 10,000 years at the remains of the American bison, you could completely overlook and miss the fact that they came within a whisker of becoming extinct. Right? Because your precision may not be, because we're talking about a 1 or 2 century window that could easily get lost in the noise of 10 or 20,000 years. And so I think that there was this tendency to overlook that you could have had a catastrophe that could have been on a continental scale, and it would be easy to overlook if you're only looking at one narrow range of the evidence. And I think you would agree that really, if you're going to become literate in the subject of catastrophism, you have to look at ice ages. You have to look at sea level changes. You have to look at mass extinction events. You have to look at archaeological and what you brought up earlier, which I think is extremely important. Ultimately, what are the ramifications for human civilization? You have to look at all of these things. You have to consider, what are the triggers? Are the triggers are they confined to the Earth itself, which would say endogenous within, or from outside? Now, from my perspective, I think that the ultimate trigger is outside. Primarily, primarily going to be impact related, but also the sun probably has a role. And I think we have to start looking at the solar system holistically and consider that the Kuiper disk of comets, the heliosphere of the sun, the Oort cloud, all of this is an integrated system that we call the solar system. And there has been constant interaction between the Earth and the larger cosmic framework in which it exists. And I
Let's
think, and then I'm going to turn it over to you and rest my
Okay.
vocal for a
Okay.
minute. So what I'm thinking here is that we have to consider that many of these things could be consequences that are not, you can't immediately tie them to an event like an impact, but an impact could perhaps, or in fact is likely to trigger a whole cascading system of feedbacks that could take centuries, even millennia to play out.
hmm
And on that note, so a lot of the critics who've dismissed the idea of an impact think everything should with an impact should be instantaneous. And I argue no, that's not a conclusion that we can come to, because it
I agree.
very likely is that there's going to be a whole series of feedbacks that play out that take in fact, I would even go so far as to say that perhaps a lot of the volcanism and seismicity that we are experiencing in the world today are still after effects of those great terminal ice age Younger Dryas
I would
phenomena.
agree. Yeah. I just wanted to say, let's dive into this because I know what people are thinking. Well, what caused the extinction of the megafauna? So let's dive into your thoughts on that, the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. Can you explain what is the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis and how does it bear on this extinction level event that we've been talking about with the megafauna?
Ah, that's a great question, which is worthy of many hours of discussion. But to put it in a nutshell, uh, basically the Younger Dryas, first of all, the name, the Younger Dryas. So there's a Younger Dryas. There was also an Older Dryas. Now, the Younger Dryas is a climate episode that's named after a polar wildflower that grew in Europe, and it's a cold loving plant. So when the temperature is cold, this plant will proliferate, but it doesn't do well in warm weather. So there was a period where the older Dryas was, I think we go back to 14,600 to 15,000 years ago, somewhere in there. It was quite prevalent in northwestern Europe, in that strata. Not, it's not growing there today, but the pollen and the remains of this plant, the Dryas octopetala is the plant, eight-petaled flower. So the Dryas octopetala, so the climate period was named after the flower that sort of was used to identify this climate period. So there was an older Dryas, it gave way to the Bolling and the Alarode, and these two climate periods were much warmer. Then around 12,900 or a little younger than that years ago, there was a sudden flip in the climate, a sudden switch. So the climate appears to have been warming for between 2 and 3,000 years post 15,000 years ago. Okay, and this warming could be explained, and probably could be explained by the naturally shifting relations in the Earth-Sun geometry. Okay, leading to what are known as the Milankovitch cycles, which, because of this changing the distance of the Earth to the Sun, the obliquity of the Earth, the precessional period, those three things combined changes the geometry between the Earth and the Sun. That changing geometry affects how much solar radiation reaches the surface of the Earth. So there's a period where the three forces can combine in such a way to reduce the amount of solar energy. Other times they can combine to increase the amount of solar energy, and other times they cancel each other out and have very little effect. So the Milankovitch cycles were aligned for a warming between, say, 13 and 15,000 years ago. And what we do see is that the glaciers from their most extreme extent began to shrink back. And they maybe lost 10% to 15% of their total mass during this period. One of the consequences of that is that the two great ice sheets that covered North America, the Cordilleran on the west, the Laurentide on the east, centered over Hudson Bay, they had been in confluence during the late glacial maximum. And during this warming period, they melted back enough to open up what's known as the ice-free corridor.
hmm
Okay, so anyways, the Younger Dryas then was this climate event where, after being absent for whatever, 2,500 years or so from the record. No pollen, no remnants of the Dryas octopetala. Suddenly there it is again, right? So the climatologists concluded, well, the climate must have gone cold again, and it must have gone cold pretty quick because they're there, and then suddenly they're back, right? So that is where the name, the Younger Dryas, came from, because there was an older Dryas and there was a Younger Dryas. After 2,000 to 2,500 years of warming, the climate suddenly plunged back into basically full glacial cold. All that warming of 2,000 or 3,000 years was erased within a year or two. And the planet, for the next 12 or 1,300 years, the warming that was causing the shrinking and the melting back of the glaciers apparently stopped. And in fact, there's some evidence that the glaciers began to really to extend their mass again. Well, then at the end of the Younger Dryas, which is now dated at about 11,600 years ago, there was a very sudden melting, rapid rise of sea level, what John Shaw refers to as CRE, a catastrophic rise event. And it was dated and is now dated at 11,600 years ago, which is now the dividing line between the Pleistocene, the Ice Ages, and our modern Holocene of interglacial warmth. Okay, so for several decades now, the Younger Dryas has been identified. They're aware of it. The scientists are aware of it. They know that there's been this sudden shift in climate. What caused it? Okay, a number of theories were proposed. Probably the dominant theory up until 2007 was that there was a change in the thermohaline circulation of the Atlantic current. And probably due, we talked earlier about Glacial Lake Agassiz, which was a tremendous, huge volume of cold meltwater.
All that fresh water pouring into the ocean.
Yes, that's exactly it. All that fresh water pouring into the North Atlantic temporarily caused an interruption of the Gulf Stream, basically, and it was not delivering its heat to Europe anymore, and therefore that caused a plunge in average temperatures during Europe. Now, the fact that the drainage of Lake Agassiz is associated with that time period, the onset of the Younger Dryas, I think is significant. However, that idea was pretty much, while it was a dominant idea, what happened in 2007 is that you had a group of scientists led by Richard Firestone who were looking at the extinction-related events, and they were examining that horizon where the Younger Dryas boundary, which was dated now based upon volcanic evidence, the dating of volcanic ash, looked like it was happening probably around 12,900 years ago. Okay, so he's looking at that, and there's a famous paper that came out in 2007. I can pull up the exact name of it, or maybe you can.
You're talking about the Comet Research Group, correct?
The Comet Research Group was an outgrowth of this paper that came out in 2007, led by Richard Firestone, James Kennett, Alan West. I think that there was 17 names, George Howard. I think there was 17 names on that paper, and basically they proposed that there had been an impact of some kind related to the sudden extinction of the late Pleistocene megafauna and the simultaneous disappearance of the Clovis culture in North America. So that paper came out in 2007, and it really launched a very controversial period. And there were a lot of critics who went to great lengths to discredit this idea. Because for one thing, it totally discredited the idea of the overkill hypothesis. If suddenly it's not Paleo-Indian hunters in their, Birkenstocks and loincloths killing off these mammoths, it's something from outer space.
And it brought back the old specter of catastrophism, which really irritated them.
Yes, it did. And see, one of the things important point you made earlier when you were talking is you made, when we look at catastrophism and we look at, say, what I would think of as the sort of the resurrection of catastrophism, that that I think could be pinpointed to 1980 when those three teams independently came up suggesting that the dinosaurs were exterminated by an impact of something from space based upon the huge spike of iridium that was found precisely at the KT boundary, right?
Mhm.
Well, that made it acceptable to talk about catastrophes in Earth history. Well, what now with the publication in 2007 of a potential impact less than 13,000 years ago, now suddenly impacts from space are not something that are far removed from the human experience. Boom, it's set right down in the middle of the human experience on planet Earth. And nobody, really, a lot of people didn't want to go there and
For
still
many
don't.
reasons, for many reasons. And one of the reasons is precisely what we said earlier, that it validates, it verifies the universal testimony of the ancients in regard to
It does.
cataclysm and the resetting of human civilization, and they don't want to go there. That's for
No.
sure.
When you open that can of worms, now you're having to really, in a way, reevaluate all of our models of ancient history and prehistory.
That's right. The accepted timeline of history that historians and archaeologists go to great lengths to reinforce, to affirm, and to protect. They vigorously protect this. I call it a Darwinian timeline of history because just like in the theory of evolution propounds that as it relates to mankind, that we began as basically a single-celled amoeba, and we were a shrew, and then we were this and this and the other thing, and we got larger and larger and more intelligent, and so there's this gradual ascent in the size and in the intellectual capabilities of the human species. And this is what I again refer to as the Darwinian paradigm of history. But it may be that we're not the best and the brightest, that maybe some of the things that we've accomplished today have been accomplished before us, and that the ancients were much more extraordinary than we've given them credit for, and potentially, and I would say certainly, much more biologically robust than we are as well, and biologically, and I would say intellectually. And that is taboo among modern historians. That is taboo, and archaeology and historians absolutely reject that notion.
Yeah, and absolutely, that's I have to agree with that 100%.
I'm talking about I'm talking about what they perceive as cavemen. I'm not talking about the ancient Greeks, because they'll laud the ancient Greeks all day long, and the ancient Egyptians. But if you start to imply, wait a minute, maybe these people you're calling cavemen were not apish idiots. That's where you start to run afoul with this crowd.
Yeah. Now, is it possible that humans dwelt or took refuge in caves? Absolutely.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah. I had one of my guests recently, a few months ago, Martin Grant, who's very interested in all of this. He's studied, the evolution of ancient humanity. And he pointed out that, and I say evolution with some qualifications, right? Because I'm not doing it in the context of a strict Darwinian model. Anyways, right. I really wasn't aware of this yet, but this is one of the reasons I really enjoy having conversations with other people who are studying and learning about this. He pointed out, so, there's evidence that a lot of people during the late Pleistocene had larger cranial capacity than now, up to 15% larger. And I said, maybe I've heard that, but he sent me a paper and I haven't fully digested it. But yeah, there's a number of studies out there now.
The implications of having 15% more cranial capacity are enormous.
Exactly. Exactly. And now I'm, thinking, well, the conditions during the Ice Age were so drastically different than the world we inhabit. And, one of the things, that was like a low carbon dioxide world, because with the onset of the Ice Ages, you have the cooling of the oceans. And when the oceans cool, they start sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. And during the late glacial maximum, the estimates I've seen now is that carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere got as low as 180 parts per million. Now, right now, they're at about 410 to 420. Pre-industrial was about 280, right? But when you get down to 180 parts per million, you really start compromising photosynthesis. And in fact, a lot of the type of crops that are fit for human consumption are high CO2, require high CO2,
Right.
like at least 280 to 300 parts per million for viability. But when the CO2 pressure gets that low during the drawdown of CO2, you get to the point where, well, for example, 150 parts per million, photosynthesis begins to shut down, literally begins to shut down. And as you drop below 150, what you'd be seeing is the die-off of literally the planetary biosphere. So during the late glacial maximum, I mean, literally the planet came almost within a whisker of a major biotic event, a mortality event.
A die-off, yeah.
A die-off, yeah. However, and you have to then at that point begin to look for external forces at work. Why did the planet, see, and it gets back to a fundamental question. Why did the planet go into a full-blown ice age? And when we're talking about, and we'll come back to the Younger Dryas in a second, but because these are all the questions that have kind of led up to it. A lot of mysteries there. Like, first of all, here's the problem. When you go from an interglacial to a glacial, we're in an interglacial right now, and there's about, I think, roughly 6 million cubic miles of glacial ice when you add together Antarctica and Greenland, which are the two primary sources. Go back to the late glacial maximum, there was more than double that volume of ice, and that was what caused the drawdown of sea level by more than 400 feet. That in itself, as you would be well aware, has extraordinary implications. It also has implications like for during the late glacial maximum, where would have been the most opportune and optimistic locations for human settlements? Well, undoubtedly along the coastlines of the world, for the very reason that the proximity to the ocean is going to ameliorate the climate.
That's right. And
So
they would have been the ones most devastated
Yes.
by
Yes.
let's say by whatever the cause is, but certainly by an impact event.
Yes. And of course, the rapid rise in sea level. And
Yep.
we know that coastlines of the world can be tremendously energetic places with the tides and the rising and the falling of the surf. I mean, we're seeing constant examples of how cliff faces are being undermined and people's mansions falling into the ocean, things like that. But the rapid rise of sea level, I mean, you can probably figure that the energetic forces played out over the coastlines of the world are going to be much more extreme than they are today.
And along the rivers.
And along the rivers. Very good point. And I want to bring up, before we're through with this, I'd like to bring up some digital elevation maps of some of the modern river valleys so people can see that virtually all the rivers of, say, North America occupy these oversized channels like we were discussing with the Minnesota River Valley. Almost all of them. In fact, I could say that I think just about every river valley that I've now examined would do that. Is Andre? Well, I could actually pull up some slides.
While you're doing that, let's see if I've got this correct. So I'm a proponent of the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, although I'm a novice in it. It makes a lot of sense to me. I'm open to other causes as well. I'm not completely sold on it, but it seems the most logical to me. So the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis posits that the Ice Age was brought to an abrupt end by an impact or series of impacts, and there's a theory that maybe there was a large asteroid, and we either went through the debris field behind it, we passed through the debris field, and the Earth was bombarded with comets or fragments of this asteroid, and particularly on the North American ice sheets. Is that the gist of it?
I think that's the gist. There are variations of it.
Right.
I would think I would be leaning towards a fragment or fragments of a disintegrating comet.
Okay.
And what we know about comets now, it used to be you had comets and you had asteroids. They were two different, just like, you know, uh, Homo sapiens sapiens in Neanderthal. Now we know that they've genetically interbreeded, right? Well,
Right.
comets and asteroids now actually have hybrids. There's objects that seem to partake of the properties of asteroids simultaneously with the properties of comets. I think the theory, and this is, no, I'm going to say hypothesis, the hypothesis that is being tested and that I think has the greatest possibility of substantiation is the idea that there was a very large comet captured out of the Kuiper disk somewhere between 25 and 30,000 years ago. And we see that there was a major shift in the climate during that period of time, which was the rapid cooling that occurred and marked the beginning of what's called the late Wisconsin glacial period. And it was at the time we were in what's called an interstadial, which means a period of time where the ice had shrunk back because of warming, but it had not disappeared to the point where the planet would have been in a full interglacial mode like we are now. Okay, so you had the late glacial maximum, usually dated between 15 and, say, 23,000 years ago. This idea is that between 25 and 30,000 years ago, roughly, a large comet was captured into a subjovian orbit, which means it's being handed back and forth between the sun and Jupiter, and it begins to undergo a hierarchy of disintegrations and litters near Earth space with a lot of debris. Now, this is circling the sun in an orbital ring that is lying close to the plane of the ecliptic, and the Earth's orbit intersects the orbit of this debris stream from this disintegrating comet. So in that model, what you have is the potential for multiple impact events. And also, see, that takes it from the, to me, oversimplistic model of just one single rogue asteroid crashing into the Earth. So everything should then be correlated back to that singular event. And if there's a century or a millennia of differential in the timing, well, then it couldn't have been an impact of anything from space. Whereas this model, which actually is pretty consistent with a lot of the catastrophist models that have come out of the UK over the last 25 to 30 years. If you know the work of Victor Klube or William Asher or several of these others that have sort of led this British school of catastrophism looking at the effects of large comets. They proposed in a 1980 book called The Cosmic Serpent that the terminal extinction event and climate change at the end of the Pleistocene could have been triggered by impact of something from space. They had actually proposed that as early as 1980. So anyways, in that scenario, you might have, and they coined the term an epoch, a bombardment epoch. So within that bombardment epoch, what you have, and it might last, over a period of centuries or even a millennia. During that period, the Earth is going to be much more susceptible to impact events than the in-between times. And at the point at which most of this debris has been cleared out of the solar system, either by ultimately breaking down into a stream of dust, which, by the way, would have its own consequences, or being swept up into the Jovian orbit, or ultimately probably falling into the sun would be the most likely fate of this material, being consumed by the sun. But, for example, if you have the Earth passing through a field of cosmic dust that's also could be generated by this disintegrating comet nuclei, that's going to increase the opacity of the atmosphere, which is going to cause a greater reflection of solar heat away from the Earth and hence a cooling of the Earth. So that could be a factor. Then, of course, if you have the macro scale stuff actually impacting the Earth itself, it's either going to impact on the oceans or on the land, or during an ice age, there's going to be a higher probability of an impact into glaciated areas. Now, if you have an impact on land, generally what's going to happen is it's going to again, and depending on the size of the impactor, typically a half-kilometer impactor moving at, let's say, 20 miles per second, which could be a typical velocity, closing velocity as they're approaching the Earth. If you have an object, say, half a kilometer in diameter up, now you're talking about a global scale response to that on a global level. Half a kilometer is not going to cause a worldwide mass extinction, but it is certainly going to cause a regional mass extinction. If you have a multi-bombardment episode, though, it takes it up into a whole different realm because you could have impacts onto land, which are going to inject enormous amounts of dust and secondary material into the atmosphere. Also igniting widespread fires.
That's right.
Then
biomass burning. Yep.
Yes, biomass burning, and that's going to further contribute to the contamination of the atmosphere with all the soot and so forth, right? So you've got the combination of fires with soot, you've got the injection of dust, fine dust into the atmosphere, right? Then in large areas that are going to be wiped out, like let's say if it's a hilly topography with forests, the forests get wiped out. Now what happens is the landscapes are susceptible to catastrophic erosional events because
that's right.
Yeah, exactly. Now on the other hand,
also you would have,
go ahead. No, go ahead.
You would also have, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, depending on the size of the impact and where the impacts occur, you would also have accompanying seismic activity.
Yes.
And volcanism.
Yes, both of those are going to be very logical and natural responses to the sudden release of energies on the scale.
That's right. So in other words, we're earthquakes in diverse places around the Earth and a chain reaction of volcanic explosions.
Yes, and we know because we can see now, I've got photographs I could pull up and show you that you have massive amounts of volcanic ash sandwiched in between backflood layers from catastrophic flooding. So that is evidence that these volcanic eruptions were going on at the same time.
Simultaneously.
Simultaneous.
I mean, we're talking about almost an unimaginably destructive cataclysm when you combine all these together, because you're not just talking about like an atomic bomb going off or nuclear bomb going off. You're talking about a cascade of catastrophes unfolding simultaneously across the Earth, and to varying degree depending on where you are on planet Earth. If you're in proximity to the blast zone, I mean, you're going to be vaporized. But you're talking about, as we said, earthquakes all over the Earth, chain reactions of volcanoes going off all over the Earth, obviously tidal waves sweeping across the land, and you're talking about the biomass burning, wildfires erupting all over the planet. Because I was reading an article, I believe by the Comet research group, and they were talking about the ejecta that would have come off of the superheated ejecta.
Yes.
That gets, in other words, when a let's say a comet impacts the Earth, you have these superheated pieces of that comet that go flying into the air, and they can land, I don't know how many miles away, hundreds of miles away. And if one of those lands into a forest, you got a huge forest fire.
Exactly. And so we're talking about impacts, like say on land. But land is close to only being 1/4 of the surface of the Earth. So it's not an unsound assumption to say that for every impact on land, you would have probably 3 impacts into the ocean.
That's right.
And you said, like you said, tidal waves. You're going to have tsunamis generated from that. And also think about this, Timothy. If this happens during the late glacial maximum and sea levels are 400 feet lower, what they've done is they've exposed millions of square miles of continental shelf, low gradient continental shelf that's now drowned, submerged under 400 feet of meltwater. Well, when you have a tsunami, 2 things of interest: the run-up height and the run-in height. And you can picture this, of course, if you've got a steep land, when it makes landfall, if you've got a steep gradient, it's not going to flow in if you've got a mountain there that's 1,000 feet high and the tsunami is 100 feet high, it's not going to run in.
Not going to penetrate very far inland.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Not going to penetrate. Good word. Now, on the other hand, go down to the very low gradient continental shelves. And if you got a 200 or 300 foot tsunami, and we know that such things have occurred, that's going to have a tremendous run-in distance. And it's going to pretty much erase anything
in its path.
Anything that's on. Yeah.
And all of the evidence of anything that once existed there, if there was any civilizations, gone. I mean, it would wipe the slate clean. Now tell us what would, because this is very interesting to me. What about when that, let's say, the fragments of the comet impact on the ice sheets?
Now that's where it starts getting interesting. And in order to try to understand that, I've had to look at some of the studies of oceanic impacts are much more limited than the studies of continental or land-based impacts, right? But of course, one of the things that happens when you have an oceanic impact, several things, creates a transient cavity. You got your water. Let's say that the water is, 2 miles deep and an object a half a mile strikes the ocean. Well, that's, I think, about the cutoff where the momentum of the impacting object is strong enough to fully penetrate the water column and actually leave a signature on the seafloor.
Like a crater on the seafloor.
A crater on the seafloor. But you got a problem there, because here's the problem. That impact causes this transient cavity to spread outwards from the epicenter of the impact. And so for a period of time, you're going to have an exposed sea bottom. If it's deep enough. If it all depends on the ratio of water depth to impactor size and velocity. So, I mean, you could have an impact where it does not reach the bottom, but it certainly is going to generate huge waves. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Well, one of the things that happens when that water rushes out, of course, it has to then ultimately collapse back in. So when it does, the waves collapsing back in are typically supercharged with sediment. And it creates what's known as a turbidity current. So you've got these heavy currents washing back in to where the crater would be. And so what they do is, if there's an uplifted rim, they can wash away or obscure the rim. Further, they then dump the load, the sedimentary load that they're carrying into the crater. The result is that would be much more difficult to discern impact events in the ocean,
because it makes a hole and fills it back in.
It makes a hole and fills it back in. That's it. Yeah. Now, on the other hand, you're going to have a tremendous release of heat energy. When that potential energy of something, let's say a half-kilometer object striking the ocean releases its kinetic energy, it's going to be enormous. It's going to cause the instantaneous vaporization and injection of water vapor into the atmosphere. And I don't have the modeling studies on my fingertips right here, but we could always do a follow-up conversation at some point. But yeah, there's been some studies suggesting that, there would be a major rainout event following in the aftermath of an oceanic impact. And, you're going to have, depending on prevailing wind directions and so on, there are going to be areas downwind that are going to get just deluged with rain.
Yeah, so we're talking about just precipitation because of all of the water that's thrown up into the atmosphere.
Yes. So when we peruse the ancient literature and the mythology and so forth, of course, we find over and over again, accounts of gigantic rainstorms.
Yeah, and not just rainstorms, black rain.
Yeah,
you have accounts of black rain. Maybe because the atmosphere is laden with volcanic ash or the debris from the impact.
Yes.
And when the rain falls, it's pulling some of that down and you get this black rain phenomenon.
Yes, that's absolutely plausible. Absolutely plausible. So for me, what I did, and I actually, began to believe that there had been an impact event in the early 90s. That was about the time that I came to believe that the mass extinctions, and by the early 90s we had extracted cores from our Antarctica and Greenland and others. The ice core shows these just extraordinarily rapid climate changes that left everybody baffled. And we're looking back 91, 92, 93. And I was doing a lot of research in that, and I thought, well, you know, why are these guys, nobody's thinking the possibility of an impact. It just seemed it wasn't on anybody's radar screen. It was too far removed. Well, we can talk about impact 66 million years ago,
Right.
but not 13,000 years ago, right?
Too close to home, yeah.
And in 1996, I gave 5 lectures at Warren Wilson College in North Carolina, where I pretty much outlined a Younger Dryas impact scenario and correlated it with the mega flooding that had occurred, and suggested that maybe that we have to look at potential impacts into ice sheets. That was in 1996. Then, of course, in 2007, we have this idea proposed in the Firestone West Kennett Howard paper that came out. And I felt very vindicated because, in 96, I'm just completely, I guess George Howard was one of the first people that I encountered that was thinking along those same lines. There was another fellow, he's a researcher out of University of Georgia at Athens. I worked on a documentary in 1996 called Fire from the Sky, and we interviewed him. Damn, I wish I could remember his name. He was actually the first one, and I could come up with his name because I think he deserves recognition, because I think he was probably the first one to really seriously begin proposing an impact at the Younger Dryas boundary. And when we did the research for this documentary in 1996, I interviewed him. And I know that at that point, it had already been a number of years that he was proposing this as a hypothesis, that there had been an impact at that point. His name may pop into my head again, but that's been a while.
Well, describe for us, if you will, what happens when a comet or a fragment of a comet or fragments of a comet impact on an ice sheet? For example, the Laurentide ice sheet. What happens?
Well, again, using the analogy of an impact into oceans, I think we can extrapolate some, although we're not going to get a complete picture, because obviously you're talking about glacial ice versus water. But otherwise, I think it's clear that we're also going to get a major atmospheric injection of water vapor. Okay, that's a given. Because for an object moving at 20 miles per second, it's not going to really recognize whether it's hitting into liquid water or frozen water. The energy so several things are going to happen. At the moment of impact, you're going to have this tremendous release of thermal energy, but also mechanical energy. The mechanical energy is going to fracture the ice sheet. Very much, you could imagine, like if somebody threw a rock at the windshield of your car and you looked at it and you've got this obvious impact site, but emanating out from that, you have these radial fracture lines. You can picture that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so think of that as an analogy, useful an analogy. You're going to have mechanical fracturing of the ice. You're going to have melting of ice. So you're going to have a large production of liquid water, and you're going to have vaporization. And that vaporization is going to go into the atmosphere. It's going to start raining out, and that is going to have secondary consequences. But in the immediate aftermath of the impact, here's what you can expect. The fracturing and the breaking up of the ice sheet, and the creation of enormous volumes of meltwater, which are now going to have ready access to the base of the ice sheet. So that water now is rapidly percolating through the fractured ice to get to the subglacial environment, where you now have enormous volumes of glacial till, and glacial till is essentially the the pulverized ground mass that has been created by the grinding effect of the heavy glaciers moving across the land, pulverizing the land, breaking it up. So in glacial till, you have this chaotic mass of material that can be from fine-grained silt through sand, through pebbles, gravel, all the way up to large boulders, intermingled, usually in a lot of cases with organic material, because whether it had been a forest growing there before the expansion of the glaciers, whatever, you're going to have this chaotic mix of stuff with no structure, no discernible structure. Now, water, by contrast to what glaciers do, water induces structure in its sediment, in its depositional effects, right? You can see that water will do stratification, it'll create bedding and all of this stuff. And then you have sort of this intermediate area that has come to be called glaciofluvial for glaciers, and fluvial meaning flowing water. Mm-hmm. So you have a continuum. On the one hand, you might have just basically glaciers with a small amount of water pulverizing, creating thick layers of glacial till. And then on the other end, you've got just water flowing that can be its erosional, its power to erode is going to be a function of how fast it's moving. That's going to be a function of the steepness of the gradient. It's also going to involve how consolidated are the channels. If it's a low coherent mass, like recently deposited alluvium or something, it's going to erode very, very fast. If it's hard bedrock, you might have huge, fast rushing water through there that does very little discernible damage to see in the aftermath. Okay, but so let's go back to the glaciers. You've smashed the glaciers just like with a giant hammer. So now you have most likely literally hundreds or thousands of pieces of broken glacier. You've got enormous volumes of meltwater that are going to initially pool on the glacier surface, but rapidly drained through the fractures down to the base. Now, we know that water is denser than ice. It's like 93% ice is the density of water. So the tendency is going to be for that water to create uplifting forces. It's going to be forcing its way under the glaciers, huge volumes of it that are constantly being replenished by the surface discharge, the term supraglacial, the supraglacial discharge. That's going to cause basically a decoupling between the ice sheet and the substrate, which is the glacial till. This water is now moving under the ice sheet under great pressure. It doesn't have a free surface to ameliorate the pressure, right? So it's being fed by this constant influx of water from above, maybe a mile and a half up. Possibly.
Right, because some of these glaciers, because some of the areas of the Laurentide, let's say the Laurentide ice sheet, are a mile high, correct?
Oh, probably
a mile thick.
Yeah, probably more than that. Probably up to, I think the estimates I've seen are up to about a mile and a half. Up to about a mile and a half thick. I mean, that's extraordinary when you think about it.
It is, yeah.
But so now you've got this water moving under the ice sheet, under pressure. And what it does, and this is from the research of John Shaw, who I mentioned earlier, coined the term CRE, which is catastrophic rise event. He was a lifelong student of drumlins, which are an interesting landscape feature of I would call them streamlined hills. And they have been confined to the geographic region of the great ice sheets. They're found in Europe. There's some very prominent swarms in Ireland. They're called swarms because you'll have these series of dozens or hundreds or more of these elongated hills, right? And they're usually, the long axis of these hills is aligned parallel to the flow direction based upon the landscape gradient. Well, John Shaw began studying these, I think, as early as the 70s, but by the 80s and early 90s, he had formulated a theory that these drumlins, which geologists have been arguing literally for 100 years, what is the origin of these drumlins? How do we explain the existence of these drumlins? And we'll pull up, I'll try to pull up a Google map here in a minute and show you, because they're pretty extraordinary when you see them. He proposed that they were created by catastrophic subglacial floods, water flowing under the ice sheets. And what it's doing is it's because of the fact that it's under much greater pressure than it would be with a free surface. What it's doing is it's shaping, it's aerodynamically shaping the till into these hills that look like inverted boat hulls, kind of, if you imagine a boat or a canoe turned upside down. And the blunt end upstream and the tapered end downstream. He proposed that these drumlins were created by subglacial floods. Well, what's the problem with that? I mean, it seemed to make sense. He could demonstrate in the laboratory that he could reproduce features on a hydraulic table, for example, that reproduced the drumlin fields and showed that they could be created by flowing water. And you would get pretty much exactly the same geometry and so forth. But here was the problem. Problem is that the drumlin fields are so vast, the amount of water to create those drumlin fields or drumlin swarms would have been huge. Huge. Like one of the drumlin swarms that's associated with Lake Ontario and just north of there, he referred to it as the Livingstone Lake event. Livingstone Lake was a glacial, post-glacial lake that existed temporarily. But his calculation of the total peak flow was 84,000 cubic kilometers of water to create that. And nobody was ready to accept that. They said, get out of here. And just like they did with Harlan Bretz, they said, if you can't show a source for those mega floods, they didn't happen. Get lost. And his response was, look, I don't know the source, but what you look at the documentation of the field, the suite of evidence, particularly when you integrate all of the disparate types of evidence, there's no other conclusion than you had the work of huge volumes of flowing water, giant currents.
Right.
Basically, John Shaw's response was the same. I don't know. They speculated. Well, could you have and ultimately what all the discussion came down to is how do you form a reservoir of water? So the assumption was you had to have a reservoir, either subglacial, superglacial on top, or end-glacial, E-N-G-L-A, end-glacial within the glacier mass. So subglacial at the bottom, end-glacial in the glacier mass, or superglacial on top. So the critics looked at all of those and said, there's no way you're going to get a reservoir of water on the scale you need to produce the flows you're estimating here, and therefore it wasn't produced by giant subglacial floods. Well, once you begin to look at the impact scenario, you can completely dispense with the idea of some prolonged creation of this giant reservoir of meltwater. You see?
Yep.
And he never, he passed away before we could get to that. I had communication with him, and George Howard had communication with him. We were just pre-COVID. I had proposed that Lake Nipigon, up there just north of Lake Superior, could be a logical starting point for a potential impact site. And we contacted John Shaw, and he was very interested. His response was, we were going to go up there, explore, look for impact proxies and so forth. We contacted him, and his answer was he would be delighted to join us for an excursion to Lake Nipigon. And then about 3 weeks later, he passed away. So that never happened. And then COVID came on. So I have not yet got to Lake Nipigon to look at what I think that could be a good starting point, because it has a lot of features that I think could be explained pretty effectively by it being an impact site.
And if you look at that lake, pull it up on a Google Maps, it's kind of got an oval shape to it. mean, you can
Yes,
imagine that being in like an impact crater.
right. And if you look at the southern margin of it, there's huge scabland erosion.
Yeah, I'm
It
looking
was
at that right now.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, it was a major erosional event. The water draining out of Lake Nipigon was not a gradual affair. It was extremely catastrophic.
And this, I mean, assuming a large celestial body slams into this thing, into the ice sheet with enough force, I mean, we could envision something like a tidal wave of fresh water sweeping down across the land, could we not?
Oh, absolutely. Now imagine you're on the Laurentide ice sheet. Uh, you're say at Hudson Bay, and we could also go to the
Can you pull the
Cordillera.
mic a little closer to your mouth? You just moved it
Yeah,
away.
sorry.
Okay.
Uh, yeah, we could imagine either Cordillera, because I think that there was an impact in the Cordilleran ice sheet up in the area of roughly around Prince George, which is on the Nechako Plateau in British Columbia. But yeah, one of the things that's going to happen is you're going to have this major runoff, this discharge, and I think I could take you to places not far from where you live in eastern Montana, up by Flathead Lake, show you where you see an initial rush of water. Because now picture, if let's just say north of Flathead Lake, a couple of 100 miles up, or up towards the plateau country up there, you have an impact. Well, if you look at the topography, it mostly slopes to the south. And you have conduit. You have the upper Columbia River Valley, you have the Okanagan, you have the Rocky Mountain Trench. All of these could have served as potential conduits for meltwater to the south. Now, in addition, okay, so you've got this impact, you're going to have a huge volume of surface water. That's going to start following the gradient of the ice sheet. And you can picture if it impacts the middle, you're a mile and a half thick, and it slopes, let's say you hit the southern sector, the surface of the glacier slopes to the south. So all of that surface water is going to flow to the south, and it's going to discharge off the terminus of the ice sheet, right? That is going to create gigantic flash floods in the areas contiguous to the ice sheet. Then that's going to be followed by the subglacial water, which is not moving at the same rate because of the fact that the shear forces are slowing it down. The environment of the subglacial environment is inducing a lot more turbulence. So it's gonna be a secondary discharge after the main surface discharge. And I'm gonna say a day, a couple of days maximum. You're gonna then have this discharge, subglacial discharge, right? Now, if we go up just north of Flathead Lake, and this is probably 15 years ago now, and I'm thinking about, okay, I'm just learning about drumlins. I'm reading John Shaw's papers, and I go, okay, so if there was the evidence I had seen south of Flathead Lake, there's a town. Do you know where Polson is at the south end?
I do.
Okay, just right there at the coast of the southern shoreline of Flathead Lake, there's hills, and it's called the Polson Moraine, named after the town of Polson. And the Polson Moraine marks the terminus of that glacial lobe, the Flathead lobe. And you can see places where it has been breached by huge volumes of meltwater, right? But you have this interesting juxtaposition of type of evidence that could, on the one hand, be explained by discharge off the surface, and that water is going to be moving fast, right? And then you're going to have discharge subglacially. The subglacial is going to be coming down. Remember, I said drumlins have been confined, and how do we know the perimeter of an ice field or an ice sheet is through the moraines, the terminal moraines, because the edges of ice sheet have very distinct topological features in the form of moraines. So we can use those moraines to determine, okay, the ice sheet came this far and it stopped here, then it may be recessed 10 miles and it built another moraine, but we can see the furthest extent of the moraine, and that will tell us. So Polson Moraine shows us where that Flathead lobe was. So where Flathead Lake now is, that was under the ice lobe. If you go just north of Flathead Lake and follow up the Rocky Mountain Trench, well, you don't have to go too far and you find hundreds and hundreds of drumlins. And I did not know. I had traversed the Rocky Mountain Trench in 1998 with my associate Brad Young. And at the time, I was not looking for drumlins in 1998. So I missed them. I traveled right through the drumlin swarm without recognizing them. Then when I came back with Google Earth and Google Maps and studied the terrain to see if there were drumlins, and drumlins show up very readily in digital elevation models. They show up very readily in Google Maps. There they were, which to me was huge evidence that the Rocky Mountain Trench was a major conduit of meltwater. And I think it was the major spigot of water that filled the basin of Lake Missoula.
Does that suggest multiple impacts?
Yes, I think it does, because you may have had delivery of meltwater. Because, for example, if you have an impact closer to the discharge point, that water is going to get there first. If you've got another impact 200, 300, 400 miles further distal from the terminus, that's going to be a secondary discharge.
Yeah,
and I think. Yes, I think that you can see evidence of a sequence of discharge events.
Yeah, and the reason why I wanted to drill down on the effects of comets or fragments of a comet impacting on the Laurentide ice sheet is you have various Native American myths or legends in which they say that their ancestors were wiped out by a moving mountain of water.
Sure.
That they saw in the distance, and it looked like this dark blue mountain moving towards them, and it was a tidal wave sweeping across the land and wiped out their people. And that could correspond to an impact or a series of impacts on the ice sheet, North America.
Absolutely. Because we know that it's indisputable evidence that you had these gigantic discharges of meltwater, way beyond anything you would predict based upon normal models of glacier melting. Normal models of glacier melting, like we've been able to document in the last 200 or 300 years with the end of the Little Ice Age, doesn't include peak discharges of 700 or 800 million cubic feet per second.
Yeah.
In fact, typically the peak volumes of the modern glacial outburst floods that we've documented are between only 1/1000th and 1/10,000th the volumes of some of the terminal ice age flows.
We're talking about a catastrophic catalyst that is, again, almost unimaginable in its destructive power.
That's right.
Slamming into these ice sheets. I want to switch gears real quick. I know we've been going for a while. I think you and we got to do a part 2 of this discussion. Because what I would like to talk about next time, we don't have time to do this today, to do it justice, would be what would it look like if you were a member of a civilization living during this time? What would the effect be? And I'd like to talk about the next time, if we have an opportunity to do this again, talk about the flood myths all around the world, the cataclysm myths, and talk about the golden age, Zep Tepi, the first time, and all of that, and how all of that might relate to what we're talking about. But before we, and that would be for next time. But to conclude this discussion, there's 2 things I'd like to do. I'd like to propose something to you, and a theory that I have about what the catalyst for, let's say that this heavenly body, this cosmic body that slammed into the earth, or fragments of something that bombarded the earth. And then I have a members community, and I have one thing I like to do when I have guests is my members will submit questions. So I want to rapid fire some questions at you from my members community. If you can indulge us and answer some of those questions. Before I do that, though, we in my members community, we're going through this book right here. Specifically Cydonia. This contains 2 books here by the late researcher extraordinaire David Flynn. And there's two books in here, both of which I think you would find very fascinating, Randall. This one's the temple. This one's the temple at the center of the time, and then the one that we're going through in my community is called Cydonia: The Secret Chronicles of Mars.
Yeah, I'm very familiar
And
with that. I've known
yeah,
Richard Goldman for years.
yeah, David died in 2012, but his twin brother Mark and his daughter Ticey are members of my community. So I've had the privilege to go through his brother and her father's work with
Okay.
him in my community, and this is an extraordinary book, which I'm sure you will find to be extremely interesting. And I'm going to see if I can send you a copy of this, Randall, along with my book and along with a version of the Book of Enoch that I published
Okay.
I published with Nate and Luke from the Blurry Creatures podcast. But the reason why I bring this book up is because in Flynn's book, Flynn postulates the idea that there was once a planet between Mars and Jupiter, what is today the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, and that at some time in the distant past, that planet exploded. And this is a popular view among a certain, like you mentioned, Velikovsky and some of those kind of catastrophism thinkers, but on a cosmic scale. And I'm wondering, and this is my theory, and it was also David Flynn's theory, that the Earth has been experiencing not just one cataclysm or two cataclysms, but a series of cyclic cataclysms, and it's like a clock. And that the catalyst for these cataclysms was in fact this event in which the planet, the theorized planet between Mars and Jupiter, exploded. And again, today it's the debris field. And the idea is that it's possible that when that planet exploded, it would have bombarded the other planets in the vicinity in the solar system, would have been absolutely decimated with the debris, right? It would have absolutely bombarded with the debris from this explosion. And it would have been a cataclysmic event like no other. I mean, a planet exploding in our neighborhood in the solar system would be unimaginably destructive. And that a fragment of this planet, a large piece of it, was shot out into it, further out into the solar system or towards the sun, and was caught in the gravity of the sun and slingshotted out into outer space. And it's now on this elliptical path around the sun where it comes in and gets slingshotted back out every 6,480 years. And this is based, by the way, and we could talk more about this next time because I really wanted to get into the zodiac with you and all of that. And this is the amount of time that the Greeks described as an aeon, 6,480 years. And the Greeks understood that the transition between aeons, which is called the syntelia, that there was cataclysm, some sort of cataclysm would rock the earth. So it's this idea of cyclic cataclysm. That's why the ancients were obsessed with the zodiac and keeping these enormous periods of time, because it was a civilization-ending event, and that's really important to know when that's going to happen. So in this theory, what amounts to this asteroid now that was produced from the explosion of this planet, which, by the way, it's my opinion and David's that the Bible identifies this planet. It calls it Rahab. And that this asteroid is now on, as I said, on this elliptical path around the sun. It comes in every 6,480 years and gets slingshotted back out. And that this massive asteroid has a debris field behind it. And the Earth passes through that debris field. Doesn't hit the asteroid because that would be absolutely devastating. It passes through the debris field, and that when it passes through that debris field, you get sometimes you will get bombarded with what amount to fragments of that asteroid in the form of comets smashing into the Earth. Sometimes maybe one big one, sometimes a bunch of smaller ones. And I'm leaning in that direction. And the biggest contention, and I talked to you on a phone call the other day about this, but the biggest contention that people have in regard to this theory is that most astrophysicists will say that the debris between Mars and Jupiter, it's not enough debris to account for an entire planet.
Insufficient. Yeah, yeah.
But there's been and I wish I could cite the paper right now, but I read a paper the other day by an astronomer who did the calculations and actually contends that in fact we would not expect to see that much debris, because most of it, and I forget what the number was, it was like 90 something percent, 98 or 99% of the matter would instantly vaporize. In that, I mean, it's an explosion that's it's like a supernova. I mean, it's almost unimaginable explosion that big. Most of the matter would vaporize, and then large chunks of it would get thrown out into the far out of our view in the solar system, and that we should only expect to see precisely the amount of residue that we see in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. And I think it's a very interesting idea. Again, my viewers would be fascinated to learn that I believe that in the biblical text there's actually a reference to this in this idea of the planet Rahab exploding and other things that happen concurrent with that. So I'm really fascinated by this idea. It does appear that the cataclysm, whatever the catalyst is, it appears to be cyclic, and this is insinuated by the ancient Egyptians in Plato's Critias and Timaeus dialogue, where they say, basically, you Greeks are unaware. Basically, you only remember one cataclysm. You don't remember the preceding cataclysms. And it's like the idea is there's a clock, and it has to do with the zodiac, and this is why the zodiac was so important to the ancients, especially the ancient Egyptians, because. And we know, and we can get into this in our next conversation, but it's the zodiac is based on the tilt of the Earth, and it takes 25,920 years to complete one wobble of the Earth, and that the zodiac breaks this system up into 12 signs, 12 houses of the zodiac, and each house is 2,160 years that it takes the time to complete a zodiacal house in that system. And this timepiece, this celestial timepiece, is ubiquitous. It's ubiquitous. You find it everywhere among these ancient civilizations. And it seems to me that there's this knowledge that's been passed down. And the reason why, one of the reasons why this is so important to them is because it's keeping time. It's tracking the cyclic cataclysm. And there are specific points on the zodiac that, when you transition into the cardinal points on the zodiac, you enter this period of time, which the ancients call the Suntelia, during which period of time you could have these impacts. This cataclysm could occur. And I think there's, I really believe that there's something to that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, can I do a share screen?
Yes, of course.
All right, let's do it. So here's your cosmic wheel. I think this is what you were just talking about.
That's it. That's the celestial timepiece.
Here it is. And all these green dots represent catastrophic events.
Look at that.
Yeah.
So, right on the transition, or right in the middle of those cardinal points for the most part.
Yeah. So you can see right here, Younger Dryas is right at the cusp of your
that's right.
Of Virgo and Leo.
But precisely right.
Yep. But so are several other much more ancient events. Like you can see 3 times around, you had Heinrich event 4, you had Heinrich event 7A, and Heinrich event 9, all of which are major climatological events whose the evidence for is these gigantic discharging of icebergs into the oceans, particularly the North Atlantic. So yeah, and then you can see the end of the Younger Dryas actually falls pretty much right in the middle of the age of Leo. When we get to 6,480, you see the onset of neoglaciation, which is generally within a few centuries plus or minus of this date.
Right.
And then, of course, 2 of those cycles, twice this gives you right there. It's within a century of the Younger Dryas. Now, the model you just described is very similar to what I've envisioned The only difference is I've pictured a comet nucleus with a debris
Right.
stream that the Earth.
Mhm.
That's really the only difference. And
Wow.
again, talking about the hybridization, it could have been something that could have partaken of both the
Of both. Yeah.
yeah, but something that of its own was massive enough that its own gravity field that was accompanied by this entourage that could
Hmm.
have reached couple of million miles.
A debris field.
A
Yeah.
debris field, yes, exactly. And because it's in an orbit, like there's going to be variability. There's going to be an increased susceptibility anytime the Earth is crossing the stream,
That's right.
right? But
That's right.
doesn't necessarily mean it's going to cross the stream when there's a dense clump, if
Exactly
you
right.
will.
Yeah. And this would explain if you're on if this is the cataclysm is cyclic, okay? And if you're going through a debris field, this explains why the results would be variegated. You wouldn't get the exact result every time because it would matter what
Correct.
you collided in. It
Yes,
would
and
matter how
yes.
much of that debris
Yeah.
field hits you, right?
And see, the critics are creating these oversimplified models that they're then attacking.
Exactly.
They're just yes, they're in from my perspective, they're definitely oversimplified. And what you're underlining here is, yeah, they're going to be certainly more variable across the time span chronologically. They're going to be variable because if you've got, like we were talking about earlier, you got a multiple impact event, you might have simultaneous impacts into the oceans, into the ice sheets, into the land. And that is going to create a really chaotic mess of stuff that's going to take some serious research to discriminate what's going on there. I like your idea. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but you'll like this. This was from the Journal of the American Oriental Society, published back in '63, The World Year of the Persians. The notion of cyclically recurrent cosmic disasters, a catastrophe by flood alternating with one by fire,
Yeah.
has been traced from ancient Babylonia and Iran through Pythagorean and Stoic philosophy.
And I would add that that's exactly what the biblical narrative conveys. It
Yes.
says that the last age was destroyed by a flood, and that the first age was destroyed by a flood, and the end of the final age will be destroyed by fire.
Yes, yes. Which in the Greek it was cataclysmos, which was the Greek term from which we get the word cataclysm, and then ekperousis. So cataclysmos was the destruction of the periodic destruction of the world by water. Ekperousis was the periodic destruction of the world by fire.
And that also corresponds, going back to the Critias dialogue, where the Egyptians said that the priests of Sais, who Solon was interacting with, according to Plato's account,
Yep.
they told him that it depended on where you lived. Sometimes if you lived by the ocean, you would be devastated and the people living up in the mountains would survive. But sometimes the people living in the mountains would be devastated and people living in
Yes.
other areas would survive. And so this to me bespeaks this notion of cyclic cataclysm, and it's somewhat random because it's like, you're slamming into something.
Yep.
The Earth is encountering something in the solar system, and it has to be something like or one of the options is that it could be something like a debris field, and that would explain the variegated catastrophes that unfold on the Earth, depending on what is slamming into the Earth as it passes through this debris field. So, but the historians and the archaeologists are so lost. They are so ignorant when it comes to the astrological stuff.
Yep.
They just think that the ancient people were just obsessed with these shiny things in the sky.
Yeah.
And they were so obsessed with them, and because they thought they were gods and so forth, they were superstitious about the sky. Well, I think it's much more complicated and sophisticated than that. I think that there was a tradition passed down through the ages. There was a precise calendar, and it was a warning: when you get into this period of time, look out, because the cataclysm's coming.
Exactly. I mean, you're thinking you've kind of come to a realm in your thinking and conclusions that are so similar to my own. I'm now like, okay, there must be some differences in there somewhere. Let me say this. Okay. when you brought up the question of whether a planet exploded, still sitting on the fence with that. I haven't gone into it enough where I would have the confidence to actually address the arguments that, that there's an insufficient mass there now. However, I would really like to see if you could dig up that paper you would.
I'll look for it.
Yeah,
I'm going to look for it.
However, and I'll say, however, on the other hand, consider Mars. I mean, obviously, Mars suffered some kind of enormous catastrophic events. I mean, I think that is a foregone conclusion. We can't explain what we're seeing on Mars now, absent some kind of catastrophe on an enormous
scale. Right. Yeah. And I would add the caveat, not just Mars. I would say all of the planets in our solar system.
All the planets and moons.
Including, and I would add this, including the Earth, if we were to strip away all of the forested areas and the oceans, I think we would see that something like that happened on the Earth as well. And the difference, me coming from a biblical worldview, the difference is that the Earth was reformed and replenished and was brought back to life. I think that's my worldview. I come from a biblical worldview, and that makes perfect sense if you look at the planets in our solar system. The rest of them are utterly devastated, and then you got this blue ball of life, where life is proliferating on planet Earth with water and forests and it just seems to me that something catastrophic happened in the solar system. And in fact, in the opening verse of Genesis, when you read the beginning of Genesis, what is the state of planet Earth in the beginning of Genesis? It is in a state of ruination post-cataclysm. That's how the Bible opens up, with the Earth in a state of utter ruination. It's desolate. It's empty. It is in a post-cataclysmic condition. And I think that is... it happened in the wake of whatever this is, whether it be the planet exploding or whether it be what you proposed earlier. Something absolutely catastrophic happened in our solar system.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the evidence is all throughout the solar system. And I mean, I've pondered the satellites of the planets, and you can't look at a single satellite and not see evidence of major impacts. And then I want to pull
Moon.
up.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, let me pull up.
I wonder, people talk about, the Goldilocks zones, and we're looking for planets that are in the Goldilocks zone. In other words, it's not too close to the sun or to a star and not too far away. It's in the perfect location for the proliferation of life, and specifically for the existence of water, right? Of liquid water.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if a planet explodes, let's say it's a big planet, okay? If that planet explodes, would the force of that explosion be enough to push the planets out of their orbits, to rearrange those bodies and push them away? I don't know. Maybe there were more than one of those planets located in the so-called Goldilocks zone before that planet exploded. These are just things that go through my head when I think about a planet exploding. Again,
right. It's
hard to conceive of such a devastating magnitudinous cataclysm as a supernova or a planet exploding. We have nothing to compare it with. We certainly cannot produce an explosion that even comes close to a planet exploding.
Right. Well, there's some anomalies in the solar system, like the axial tilt of Uranus. It's like flipped over.
That's right. That's precisely right.
The backwards rotation of Venus.
Yeah, that's right. And Andre's reminding me here that in Cydonia, I'm going to send you a copy of Cydonia, Randall. Okay. In Cydonia, Flynn actually references the paper that I'm talking about, so you'll find it.
Okay.
In the book as well,
that'd be great.
And again, for those who are in my audience, for those who are interested, we are going through this Cydonia in my members community. It is phenomenal. You will not hear this information anywhere else. Some of the other stuff we talk about in there. So, Randall, if we can, with the time remaining, can I fire off some questions to you from that were submitted by members of my community?
Sure.
Okay, here we go.
Let's go for it. Can't promise that I'll have the correct answer.
You could just say pass, and I'll go to the next one.
Okay, all right.
I've selected some questions that they submitted. They knew that I was going to be having this discussion with you. Okay, here we go. This one is coming from, and Daniel, I'm going to screw up your last name, but Daniel Benzinger or Bainzinger. Daniel asks, Mr. Carlson, have you given any consideration to the theory that the pyramid of Khafre bears varied erosion patterns, karst and sea wave erosion, that would indicate that the Giza complex may have been subjected to prolonged saltwater inundation at some point in the deep past?
Well, you wouldn't have to raise sea level too much to submerge the Giza plateau, probably a couple of 100 feet. Now, I don't really have any evidence of that. Now, there is evidence of cataclysmic discharges down the Nile River that would have been, they're coming from typically the Ethiopian highlands during the cyclical flooding of the Nile. But if we go back, 12, right back within that window again, 12 to 13,000 years ago, there's evidence of these. It's been referred to as the Wild Nile. One of the major geologists that looked at it, she called it the what was it? After the title of her paper was "After the Deluge," and she was basically addressing what these tremendous Nile River floods did to the Nile River Valley there, and those floods would have been deep enough to submerge the Giza Plateau. Now, I'm not sure about Khafre's pyramid and the evidence for salt there. Now, there's also, when you look at the Sphinx, I have looked at the topography of the landscape to the west of Giza, which generally slopes towards the Nile, and I think that there's evidence out there. There's the Salima sand sheet, it's called. Under that is almost a channel scabland-like topography that's not visible because of the copious amount of sand. But it was first detected by shuttle radar. I believe it was in the 80s when the shuttles were still flying. They used this ground-penetrating radar that could look through the sand sheet, and it disclosed that there was a flood-carved landscape underneath. So there were water flows, it looks like water flows coming from the west that also could have submerged the Giza Plateau. Now, I mean, it's the implication of the question perhaps that some of that was ocean. This I don't know.
Okay. Well, the possibility exists at least exists that the pyramids could have been at least submerged in water.
Right, but I don't see the evidence that they would have been submerged full depth. That the evidence could have been somewhere probably less than 100 feet up the side of the pyramids. But missing the casing stones. See, if those casing stones were still there, we should be able to discern water level, traces of water on those stones.
Okay.
But unfortunately, they're gone. The casing stones are gone. So.
Okay, next question. And again, if you don't, you can say pass if the question is if you don't have any information on it. Tom Carroll is asking, what are your thoughts on the Cydonia region of Mars? And do you believe that more recent NASA images are airbrushed images from Mars, from, let's say, anomalous structures on Mars?
I would have to go back and look at the more recent imagery. I spent quite a bit of time looking into that, concluded, well, yeah, I just don't have enough information to determine whether these are, somehow anthropogenic or artificial structures or purely natural structures or some hybrid in between. However, the one thing I could say with confidence is that, yeah, these features are most likely explained by catastrophic water flows. I've known Richard Hoagland for years and years. I've guested on his podcast multiple times. And during that period in the 80s when his work was first coming to prominence, yes, I was looking at that. One of the things that struck my fancy was as I started looking at the features, I started noticing some very interesting geometric relationships on a more macro scale. Now, at the time I was frustrated because there didn't seem to be enough precision or resolution to come to any definitive conclusions about it. However, I think what we can say is that the history of Mars is definitely cataclysmic, and when we accept that, and we accept that there was once oceans and water and enough
Hmm.
atmospheric pressure that the water didn't just evaporate away into space, that raises some really interesting other questions that I think we need to be open to. Uh,
Okay.
but yeah, I mean, if I had known, anticipated that question, I have a whole program I put together
But
10, 15 years ago on Mars.
well, that sounds like a whole nother discussion for us to dive into at some other time.
Oh my God, there's so
Um,
much to unpack here, Timothy.
I'm going to move to the next
Let's
question.
do.
This is a question from Dave Anthony. Have you made any additional progress on your research regarding frequency and vibration, specifically on your theory as to how the megalithic stones may have been moved and how the ancient megalithic structures were built? And I know you could probably talk for an hour on that, but could you encapsulate an answer for that?
I think I probably could because there's actually just some interesting research that's come out that I talk about in my newsletter that goes out every month, and that has to do with the discovery that the altar stone at Stonehenge it's not one of the blue stones from Wales.
That's right. That's a recent discovery.
Yes, within the last year or so. Evidence showed up that it was of a different lithology than the Welsh bluestones were. I mean, that was a couple of years ago, and that led to a more in-depth study trying to determine, well, if it didn't come from Wales, where did it come from? And it turned out that it's come from the very northern tip of Scotland. And that raises some rather interesting thorny questions because now you're talking about a transport distance of 460 to 500 miles for a 12-ton stone. And this is,
Mammoths?
well, let's see. Here's a few things that I wrote in my newsletter. Let's see. I can quote this here. So this was the work of Clark et al. What was his name? Anthony Clark. It was a paper. It was published in the journal Nature, the British, the prestigious British journal Nature. And I believe I've just found it through Google Scholar and was actually able to download the PDF of it. Anyways, him and his team, they procured samples of the altar stone. They identified the lithology, and from that, they were able to determine where it came from. But here they are describing the altar stone, and this is quoted directly out of the Nature article. The central megalith of Stonehenge, the altar stone, is the largest of the blue stones, measuring 16 feet by 3.3 feet wide and 1.64 feet thick. It weighs 6+ tons, or more than 12,000 stones. And then here's to me the very interesting thing that caught my eye. It's composed of a pale green micaceous sandstone with distinctive mineralogy. Well, that distinctive mineralogy was that it was very high in metal content. And they transported this. So let's see. So here, this is from a BBC report describing the protocol of testing and the results of that testing. So the scientists have compared analysis of the altar stone with 58 samples of the old red sandstone from Wales and the Welsh borders. They found the altar stone's composition could not be matched with any of these locations. According to the researchers, the altar stone contains a lot of barium, which is metal. The university said this was unusual and could help reveal its source, which it did. And they found that the primary source of that type of rock was the very northern tip of Scotland and up on the Orkney Islands. And of course, then you've got to transport that huge 12-ton boulder from Orkney all the way down to the southern end of Britain, almost 500 miles journey overland. And this is what the authors conclude. We posit that the altar stone was anthropogenically transported to Stonehenge from northeast Scotland, consistent with evidence of Neolithic inhabitation of the region. Now, Neolithic, Timothy, as you know, that means Stone Age, right?
Stone Age, yep.
Whereas the igneous blue stones were brought about 140 miles or 225 kilometers from the Preseli Mountains to Stonehenge, A Scottish provenance for the altar stone demands a transport distance of at least 466 miles. Nonetheless, even with the assistance from beasts of burden, rivers and topographical barriers, including the Grampians and southern uplands and the Pennines, along with the heavily forested landscape of prehistoric Britain, would have posed formidable obstacles for overland megalithic transportation. And the same problem with transport by sea. So
Yep.
the people that looked at it, Professor Pierce now is one guy who worked on it. He says it blew our socks off when we discovered it was from Northeast Scotland. It was a shock, to say the least, coming from that distance. It was remarkable. The Neolithic people must have been pretty well connected, far more connected than people give them credit for. They must have been very well organized. Stonehenge seems to be this great British endeavor involving all the different peoples from all over the island.
That's right, because you would be crossing through different tribal territories.
Yes.
It's not like just one group had run of the island.
That's correct. Yes.
And so I think what I think I can say with a great degree of confidence is that what we can ask the question, why in the world would they go through such tremendous effort to go all the way up north, 400 miles up north, to get this particular stone and drag it, or however they got it down to Stonehenge? And I think the simple answer is because they could. They could, and it wasn't as difficult for them as we would like to think.
Okay, very good point. There's one of the senior curators that works for the English Heritage, which is the group that oversees the caretaking and monitoring and managing of Stonehenge site. Heather, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her last name, Sebire, Sebire, Heather Sebire, was compelled to comment that, and this is a quote, "It is phenomenal that the people of the time brought such a large stone all this way. They must have had a compelling reason to do it." In an interview with Phys.org, Sebire speculates that Stonehenge isn't a settlement site, but a place of ceremony or ritual. And then I commented on that, and I said, yes, they must have had a compelling reason for doing so. We might ask, and what is the nature of a ceremony or ritual that requires transporting a 12,000-pound stone over 460 miles? To simply say that it had a ritualistic or ceremonial function tells us nothing. I would submit that it was the unique mineralogical properties that compelled these megalithic builders to undertake such a daunting task, whether by land or sea. Then this is how I conclude this, and this, I think, kind of addresses the question. But this opens a can of worms most archaeologists are loath to acknowledge. It has been demonstrated convincingly that these builders were also astronomers. It is now appearing likely that they were geologists as well. But this reasonable conjecture carries some seriously thought-provoking implications. Perhaps it is time to expand our thinking and realize that the ancient ritualistic functions of these forgotten people were not predicated upon superstitious and groundless beliefs, but had in fact a scientific purpose. This leads us to a conjecture I've been proposing for decades, that sacred structures found all over the ancient world, whether temples, pyramids, earthworks, megalithic structures, or cathedrals, exhibiting such striking parallels in design and function reaching across time and space, were components of an archaic technology, a technology that has been lost for centuries, if not millennia, and is now on the verge of being rediscovered. And that goes directly now to the heart of the question, because I think that technology is most definitely based upon frequency, resonance, and yes, the point you made, I think that it makes no sense to conclude that all of these ancient and archaic civilizations all over the world idiosyncratically decided, hey, let's go move these giant stones. We do not build with 50-ton stones today. Why? Because it's totally uneconomical to do so, right? It costs money, hundreds of dollars an hour, to bring in a crane capable of moving a 10-ton stone or a 50-ton stone, whatever the case. We build with stone, but they're small stones. We'll do facing stones now. We don't do anything equivalent to what our ancient ancestors did all over the world. Does it make sense that all over the world, these hunter-gatherer nomadic cultures decided in their spare time they were going to quarry 20
Yeah.
ton stones, transport them 100, 200 miles, and build this temple. Okay, maybe you could argue that there's one group of insane tribe that does this, right? And is willing to expend the amount of labor to do it. But when you have example after example after example from all over the world that they're moving these stones apparently with impunity, no, we have to ask questions.
Yes.
They had
And
knowledge.
how do they have all this spare time when they're annihilating the mammoths?
Exactly. Yeah, there we go. So yeah,
So
there are so
yeah.
many questions here, Timothy, and so much raw material for additional conversation.
Yes, yes.
I'm more than
There's so
happy.
many things I want to say, but I'm gonna put a bookmark in those things and save it for our next conversation. So let's
Sure.
maybe do one more of these questions. Um, I'm looking for a good one to end on here. Okay, here's a good one by Victor Hedman. Is there any geological evidence that you're aware of to suggest that the Earth might have been at one time encompassed by an ice canopy that collapsed during a cataclysmic event in the distant past, or a crystalline canopy? Some theologians have speculated that this theoretical ice canopy would have created an oxygen-rich greenhouse environment on Earth, allowing human and animal life to grow bigger and live longer. What are your thoughts on that?
I have not looked into that idea to the depth where I really could have a well-seasoned opinion on it. It sounds implausible to me, although with a caveat. In the aftermath of the kind of event that Timothy and I have been talking about, it is certainly clear that you could have had water vapor injected
Yeah,
into the upper stratosphere that would then freeze.
yeah.
I do not imagine that this would have encompassed the entire planet. I would
Hmm.
or it would be a regional thing,
Yeah.
maybe covering a few hundred to a few thousand square miles, maybe larger, maybe larger. But I don't think that that would be something that would persist long enough to actually affect the development of a whole
Right.
ecosystem or a whole biosphere. Although I think that there's probably some merit within that idea, and I think it does come down to what I just described. That
You know, as
yes,
you're saying this, one thing that we didn't discuss, and maybe as a final thought, you can comment on this. We talked about the impact, the devastation, the catastrophes that would have uh, ensued after an impact, the tidal waves, the volcanism, the seismic activity, the biomass burning. But what about the idea of an impact winter?
oh
Something like something akin to a nuclear winter, where all
yes,
of that debris goes up into the atmosphere, blocks out the sun,
yep.
and the Earth gets locked in a deep freeze for a period of time.
Yeah. And in fact, the same authors, Bill Napier, Victor Klube, and William Asher, wrote a book, I think it came out in 1990, called Cosmic Winter. And it proposes exactly what you're just describing. And
Okay.
in fact, Fred Hoyle independently wrote a book called Ice. And in that book, he discusses a scenario very similar to the ice canopy, but again, not a globally uniform and not something that would persist long enough but would cause a major reduction in solar heat reaching the Earth for perhaps a decade or two. And that would be enough, presumably, to maybe even inaugurate a series of feedback loops
Hmm.
that could help to perpetuate. Yeah. I mean, there's so much. Every sentence we've got, we could
Yeah,
deviate
yeah.
off
It,
into.
it would it would certainly make it very difficult for the survivors in the aftermath of that
Yes,
impact. It would add insult to injury for those
absolutely.
people. Yeah,
It would add insult to injury.
yeah. So, Randall, thanks so much for joining me. How do people find you online?
Yeah.
Do you have anything out there that you want to promote?
Yes.
Let people know how they
I do.
follow you.
Okay, so I partner with a internet platform called HowTube, and between HowTube and Rumble, you can find most of my content now. HowTube, you can also randallcarlson.com is a good one. My podcast that I'm doing now is called Squaring the Circle. And I got, I think, 109, 110 episodes of my former podcast, which I'm actually still doing, still keeping that live, called Cosmographia. And in there, I just really, I think we've got 110 episodes. So I really dive into a lot of this stuff. I've also got, I've done live streams. I did several episodes of a live stream about the whole question of Atlantis, and it goes into something like 9 hours,
Wow.
where I
That sounds
really,
fascinating.
it is, and it's based on a line by line reading of Plato.
Well, I would love to get into Atlantis next time we talk. So my plan today was to talk about all the things we talked about, plus the antediluvian world in general and the Atlantean paradigm and all that. That would take us another couple hours. So let's put a bookmark in there. And I hope you'll come
Yeah.
back and have that discussion with me.
Oh, I'd love to, and I'll just promote one more thing. One of the things that was so important to the ancient world was geometry, as you know, geometry,
Definitely.
astronomy,
Yep.
etc. So I've studied very deeply into the ancient traditions of sacred geometry and how it was used by the Egyptians, the Greeks, the megalithic builders, and so on. And I put together a program to introduce people to the methodology of the ancient geometricians, from the Egyptians down to Plato, Pythagoras, etc. So I'm going to be doing a weekend retreat at the end of February at a place called Beersheba Assembly. It's on the Cumberland Plateau of Tennessee, and we've reserved a bunch of rooms. We've got a great space there, and it's going to combine some hands-on in the methodology of sacred geometry. How did they use the straight edge and the compass? And then how did that translate from there into the field if you're going to lay out a temple or a pyramid or a hinge circle, etc.? How was astronomy incorporated into it? Then we're going to do a field trip to a chapel in Sewanee, Tennessee, near where this retreat is going to be held, it's a Gothic inspired chapel, and it was derived from an analysis of Chartres Cathedral in Amiens. So in the retreat, we'll be looking at how did these medieval master builders incorporate geometry. So it's sort of a hands-on introduction to the ancient system of geometry. Now, in the more advanced stuff that I'm hoping to do in the future, we will go directly into how these geometric forms relate to resonance and to frequency and the whole system of cosmological numbers that underlie what I think is a science of resonance and frequency. But this is the entry into that realm. So that's coming up. You'll find out if you people are interested in it. Go to howtube.com or randallcarlson.com, and I'll have all the specifics up there.
Well, that sounds amazing, but alas, I'm going to be in Costa Rica during that
Well,
period
there
of
will
time.
be future
I'll have to
events
come
like
to one of
this.
those. I'm very, very intrigued by all of that. And all I can tell you, Randall, is you're really going to like the book Sidonia by David Flynn.
Okay.
So
I
I'm going to
can't
get
wait.
those books over to you. And thank you, sir, for taking the time. This was utterly fascinating. And I knew we would have a great conversation. So I look forward to interfacing with you again.
Yeah, and maybe we can hook up out there in the floodlands because you're right on the,
It's right here in my home state of
yeah,
Montana.
right in your backyard.
All
Okay,
right,
yep,
brother.
that'd be fun. All right, thanks, Timothy.
Thank you.